Hey everyone, welcome back to Toast and Topics.
Today's episode will be focused on New York City's recent decision to implement a congestion tax on motorists traveling through Manhattan. This tax is to be implemented south of 61st Street, which is a very good chunk of the city, and it's set to take effect on June 30th this summer. It's set up to have a major impact on traffic patterns in the city. So we're going to spend this episode talking more about what congestion pricing is and what it hopes to accomplish, and then open the discussion to broader issues that are linked to the topic, including American auto culture, urban planning issues, lagging public transit, as well as potential solutions to close the gap with other countries.
There's really a lot to unpack here besides just a toll increase, so let's jump right in. Sachin, do you want to start off here by talking about congestion pricing as a concept and the issues of traffic in New York City more broadly?
Yeah, let's get into it. So I grew up outside of Manhattan and now have a pretty short commute to Lower Manhattan each day for my work. And while downtown Manhattan is generally quieter and much easier to get around, I can tell you that traffic near Midtown is absolutely abysmal in most hours of the day. The Los Angeles Times put out a piece once that stated that the average speed of traffic in Midtown Manhattan is only 4.7 miles per hour. I mean, I think I can walk faster than that in some cases. New York has been ranked as America's most congested city, and cumulatively, motorists spend about 10 days a year sitting in their vehicles in New York, which is pretty shocking. So the point being that driving in New York can be a nightmare, and it does not offer as much utility to drivers as it should.
Yeah, I've been in New York cabs before, and I do recall the gridlock being pretty terrible, especially in the busier parts of the city. So, on that note, how does the proposed congestion tax help to resolve this traffic issue?
So, unsurprisingly, congestion pricing is a strategy that's aimed at reducing traffic in urban areas, and that's accomplished by simply charging tolls for vehicles entering certain zones of the city during peak hours. And the idea is to really discourage unnecessary driving, and to incentivize the use of public transportation or alternative modes of transportation, which are both cheaper and less energy intensive. And it's also designed to make driving a better experience for those motorists who still pay the fee and choose to take the road. Um, the revenue generated from congestion pricing is usually used for improving public transit infrastructure. Some examples of that could be upgrading the subway systems or expanding bus systems and services. Um, and it's also used to fund other transportation related projects. Um, so congestion pricing has been implemented in other cities around the world, including London, Stockholm, and Singapore. And it's had varying degrees of success in reducing traffic congestion and improving air quality. In the case of New York City, as mentioned, all of Manhattan south of 61st Street, which is pretty much from the southern end of Central Park onwards, will be charged $15, and that will be charged to each vehicle's Easy Pass tag. Um, During peak hours from 5 a.m. to 9 p.m. and on weekends from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., these tolls will be in effect. And out of these hours, vehicles will pay $3.75. This will impact not only day-to-day drivers, but it'll impact trucks and buses as well. They'll pay a much higher toll of $24 to $36. And it will even impact Uber drivers and taxi cabs. You can expect an additional $1.25 or $2.50 charge for any given ride. So this will literally impact everyone here. According to the officials in Manhattan that are in charge of implementing this, they hope that congestion pricing can reduce the number of vehicles entering the area. They estimate it'll reduce that impact by 17%, which would be about 153,000 fewer cars in that large portion of Manhattan. They also predicted that this plan would generate about $15 billion in revenue, and that is designed to be used to modernize the city's subways and buses.
That's a Very helpful overview of the policy, Sachin. With all that said, I think it's now worth taking a step back to consider how we've gotten here with respect to New York and also the country more broadly. Though New York has notable issues with traffic, it's unique relative to many other American cities because it does have a robust public transit system that can service the population in lieu of cars. As we'll see, the policy seems to be uniquely tailored to New York in that sense. In contrast, it's often essential to own a car in many other American cities. America is far more reliant on cars than any other big country, averaging roughly two vehicles per household. So America has over 900 cars per 1,000 people. And in contrast, other big economies like Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom all have between 600 and 700 cars per 1,000 people, so quite a bit lower. China has just 238 cars per 1,000 people. The dominance of automobiles in the United States is deeply linked to the way in which our cities have been planned. Suburbs have been the defining organizing unit of populations around cities in America, meaning that it is common for people to live in large homes well away from city centers. In those environments, it's often essential to have a car to go out to eat, to meet up with friends, or to commute to one's job. So we have sprawling metropolises that were really designed to accommodate cars. That has some pluses. New York notwithstanding, America's traffic is about 27% faster than that of other members of the OECD club of mostly rich countries. But this massively autocentric culture has also straitjacketed many of the policies that we can pursue related to public transit in this country. American cities are characterized by low population density and urban sprawl because people tend to get from point A to point B with cars. Compared with other OECD countries, American cities are 24% less populous, cover 72% more area, and have 67% more large roads. That's great if you're a car owner, but it makes it challenging to provide cost-effective and efficient public transit services. If you build a train station, for example, there's just no guarantee that enough people will live near it to justify using it. That can lead to a vicious cycle. Only about 5% of Americans use public transit to get to work. The market for transit is very small, and to keep even that small share, transit agencies often offer low fares, which means that they're starved for resources to further expand their services. As a result of that, in most American cities, only around 30 to 40% of operating costs for public transit are actually covered by fares. That really is not very much at all. Transit systems in cities like London and Toronto, in contrast, have higher fares, but also more frequent service, which makes them attractive alternatives for people who own cars. So summing all that up, New York's congestion tax is unique in that it runs counter to the very car-centric mindset and lifestyle that dominates many American cities. And it also reflects the unique character of New York. It has enough public transit that switching from cars is likely easier to do for many New Yorkers than it is for people living in the rest of the country.
Yeah, those are all really interesting points, Ben. And I think it's very apparent that the US lags other countries in terms of public transit infrastructure. For anyone that's traveled to Europe, for example, I know people always come back praising the quality of public transit there. And, things work and they work well. That's just taken as a given. And even between the US and Canada, interestingly, there are some pretty noticeable differences. If you compare the city of Portland to Vancouver, for example, or Salt Lake City to Edmonton, culturally and economically, they are very similar cities. But in each case, the Canadian city has about 2 to 5 times as much transit service per capita. So there's also correspondingly more ridership in those cities. So I think it's definitely worth us spending a few more minutes talking about why we lag our peers in public transit in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to unpack that a bit more. I think one of the big reasons, as mentioned a bit earlier, is poor city planning. A big problem is that American cities don't make particularly good use of the land near their transit systems. For example, many stops on the San Francisco Bay Area's rapid transit, which is known as the BART, are surrounded by mostly strip malls, single-family homes, or gigantic parking lots. That makes it hard for most people to actually access this transit system. Similarly, Dallas has many miles of light rail, but that doesn't necessarily equal a valuable transit system. Dallas's light rail has about as many miles as Barcelona's train system, but the key difference is that there's just not a whole lot near Dallas train stations, and so people don't really want to use it. In Barcelona, on the other hand, there are apartments, there are stores, businesses, churches, basically everything that you need for daily life.
And I'll stop you right there because that really does resonate with me. Just about a week ago, I was trying to play tennis in Jersey City. This was further into the city, and the courts were not close enough to walk from the nearest train station. So I had to take the train all the way out for about 15, 20 minutes, and then call an Uber for a short 5 to 7 minute ride to get there. But I still needed that Uber to cover that last leg of the journey.
Yeah, that's a case in point. And moving on from that, the second major issue is political, I think. The reality is that many American politicians don't really see public transit as being as much of a utility as politicians in many other countries do. I think there's an idea in the US that public transit has existed for people who can't afford to drive. Nowadays, many politicians don't see public transit as really a vital transportation function, especially for those who represent rural or suburban districts. Public transit is simultaneously something that's not really as necessary because of the low population density in those communities. So it's not necessary economically. And then it's philosophically also not something that they resonate with very much. There's an emphasis on individualism and self-reliance in America broadly, but I think also, especially in rural areas, that can increase skepticism of large-scale public transit.
Yeah, and that raises the question in my mind of how cities can get away with charging higher fares while still making sure that poorer people have reliable transportation. It's a challenge, but I think that the reality is that it has been done successfully in other cities. Paris, for example, each municipality is legally obligated to pay the transit agency the difference between its fares and operating costs, and that allows it to achieve efficient service while also keeping fares down for those who need it most.
With all that said, let's talk about both sides of the debate here for New York City's congestion tax, as well as some potential solutions to hopefully make New York's residents less burdened with traffic. So, Sachin, do you have a pulse on how New Yorkers have reacted to this new proposal?
Yeah, so broadly, New Yorkers have actually supported this proposal. Public comments submitted to the MTA run at about 60% in favor of the proposal for raising taxes on congestion. And I think that there's two obvious pros to this, and we've talked about it a bit earlier. First is just less traffic. As mentioned, this decision can reduce the traffic traveling through Manhattan by over 150,000 cars per day. So that means less hours wasted in traffic, less pollution, and safer streets for people to walk through. The second is toll revenue. This can obviously provide a reliable source of funding for the city to fix other problems that New Yorkers complain about. And most importantly, I think that's improving and modernizing the city's public transit. But there's also some serious opposition. The biggest actually comes from New Jersey residents, which are the closest neighbors to Manhattan. There's growing skepticism that congestion tax will actually accomplish any sort of traffic reduction in Manhattan, or whether it would just reroute traffic through New Jersey to avoid that tax. So that obviously annoys people that are living in the fringe cities around Manhattan. Um, Additionally, New Jersey residents are frustrated at how it will raise the already expensive cost of going into the city. Um, for me to drive into Manhattan from New Jersey, it already costs about $18 to $20 in tolls just to cross a bridge or tunnel. And now imagine paying another $15 on top of that. it suddenly becomes a $30 proposition just to get into Manhattan. That by itself supports the case for taking a train into the city as an alternative, but there could also be some potential economic harms of placing this blanket tax without making necessary improvements to public transit infrastructure in parallel. You don't want to discourage people from going into the city to support local businesses and the economy in the city. Secondly, I think there's another risk of this not succeeding in New York, and that is safety. Unfortunately, the city's buses, subways, and commuter rails have become more crime-ridden over the past few years, and that's deterred people from using them. Just in 2024 alone, arrests in New York City's public transit system have increased by 45% year to date. And we could probably spend a whole podcast episode talking about that, but you need a safe alternative to driving that people are comfortable using. And unfortunately, that will take some time to achieve.
That's a good summary of all of this, Sachin. And as the resident New Yorker on this podcast, I really appreciate you breaking down all of this for us. I can see a lot of compelling points on either side here for New York, and I'm sure that cities across the country will be eagerly watching how this policy unfolds to see if they, too, may benefit from it. But once again, New York does seem to be in a unique position to implement this kind of a policy. I think that for a long time in the rest of the country, Americans could be stuck in their cars and eating congestion fees until their own public transit systems expand accordingly.
I think you might be right, Ben. That's well put. And we'll be keeping our finger on this issue, and we'll revisit it later if things change from here. So thank you everyone for joining us. For next week, we will be going across the Pacific to China to understand how it's become such a large powerhouse in the electric vehicle market, which has been taking the world by storm recently. It'll be another great conversation, and we will see you then.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Toast and Topics. Before signing off, we wanted to disclose that the views expressed in this podcast are not representative of the organizations that we are associated with. If you learned something in this episode, please share it with a friend or leave us a review. Until next time.